In-Depth Radio.
Our team is certainly not happy. I'm not happy. Nobody's happy that we have to stop work. But that's unfortunately the way that we've had to end this situation.
When there are lives at stake, we know that we've got to explore every possible option, and there have got to be options that don't endanger the lives of rescuers. So I've asked them to explore all of those to the fullest extent possible.
A lot of people emotionally are taken aback to hear that the search effort has been called off. I mean, less than 3 full days after the incident, we heard reports of signs of life as early as 4 this morning.
Do you think that Lucy is alive?
We're hoping she is. She's a fighter. She always has been. We are hoping. Nobody's giving up.
Good morning. This is Tasha Carradine in for Jerry Agar on In-Depth Radio News Talk 1010 this week. The Lucy being referred to there is, of course, Lucy Aylwin, a woman who was working at the mall in Elliott Lake, which suffered that terrible roof collapse. She is currently missing. We're going to be talking to her fiancé, Gary Jeanbrun, at the bottom of this half hour after the 9:30 news. And we're going to be talking this whole hour about the terrible tragedy and what can or should be done going forward. The rescue efforts in Elliott Lake have been stop and start, stop and go. The townspeople are frustrated. Many of them came out last night in an attempt to actually enter the building themselves. What should be done from here? Should the Army be called in? Some people are saying that should be an option. Has enough been done? Was Premier Dalton McGuinty's intervention the right thing to do? We're going to be talking now with an expert on disaster relief. James Lee Center owns Dryit.ca, which is a disaster relief company. He's also an instructor at the Center for Disaster Recovery. Welcome to the program, James.
Good morning.
So let's start with the rescue efforts. You're an expert in this. What is your opinion of how they've been handled so far?
Haven't really been following it too closely except for what I see on the headlines. And to be quite frank with you, I know everybody's frustrated, but, you cannot enter a facility that is not safe. You cannot endanger somebody to save somebody else.
Isn't that, though, that's what's been said? And I think, isn't that, though, something that, as a disaster expert, you go into this business knowing you might risk your life for other people, like a firefighter or a policeman?
Well, you have to perform a risk assessment of what the exact hazards are and what the risks are involved afterwards, the hazard being the potential for something dangerous happening, and then the risk is really the likelihood of something happening.
And where do you draw that line? Is there an 80% risk, a 50%? How do you assess when it's too dangerous? At what point do you stop?
Well, believe it or not, if you were to go to the Center for Occupational Health and Safety and look up a high-risk situation, a high-risk situation technically is something that you would face once every 6 months in your life doing your job.
What would be a high risk? High risk to your life? High risk to
That's
your team?
Right, yeah.
And that kind of situation, once every 6 months. So give us an example of that. What would constitute a high risk? What have you seen?
Well, basically, the reality is that you cannot risk somebody else's life. On top of everything else, all workers have rights, and workers do have the right to refuse a dangerous work. Now, typically in a situation like this, you have a multitude of factors involved. Number one, designated substances. Designated substances, things like asbestos, lead, respirable silica, all of these things have to be taken into account. Different chemicals that might be on site, diesel, flammables. This designated substances and other substances have to be taken into account. And, at that point, you move ahead with your regular risk assessment. The regular risk assessment is going to be looked at for what we would refer to as, tragic circumstances. Being caved in on definitely would fall into that category. Being engulfed in debris, having things falling on you, having things collapse. This really falls, generally speaking, under the building department. The city engineers, et cetera, are going to determine whether or not it's safe to go in for somebody. And it's not unheard of when we see fires and floods, that buildings will literally be taken to the ground rather than trying to be fixed. Now, when there's somebody else inside, this is what emergency services are for. They actually, they're probably not too gung-ho on talking to the radio and everything, they're probably being told to not say anything. But if you saw the resources and the way these people look at things, I'm sure everything is being done that they can do to try and, if there's a life involved, to try and save that person. But at the same time, it's a precarious situation. It's literally teetering.
Well, if you were there right now on the ground, what would you do?
What would I do? I would perform a risk assessment and then try and find you have the problem at hand, and then you have your alternatives or your solutions. What are you going to do? And then when you look at your solutions, then you have the ever so important how to implement that solution. There's those three distinct parts. You can list all the solutions that you want, but whether or not they're viable, practical, or being able to be carried out is another story entirely. And I think probably one of the situations, I have seen some photos, is, how do you properly address the structural stability that you're dealing with? Just to, start making those assessments. You might have a series of experts, and every single one might have a differing opinion.
I'm Tasha Karadan, in for Jerry Agar this week. We are talking about the deadly mall collapse in Elliott Lake. We'd like to hear from you. In the wake of that collapse, do you think that search and rescue teams should risk their own lives to search for others? We have a web poll going. You can go to newstalk1010.com, vote yes or vote no, or you can send us your thoughts at 416-872-1010. Give us a call, Star Talk on your mobile device, or a text at 71010, and I'd be happy to read those on the air. I'm talking right now with James Lee Center. He owns Dryit.ca, which is a disaster relief company, and he's also an instructor at the Center for Disaster Recovery. So, James, I imagine you've had a lot of experiences with similar situations. Let's talk about some of the people in this, and I'm talking to people who would be trapped. How long can people last? Hate to say that, but in a situation like this, when they're trapped in a rubble or a collapsed building.
This is a bit beyond what I would actually deal with in my life, to be quite frank with you. But, at the same time, when you're dealing with people like this, one of the big issues, of course, is whether or not they're being crushed or bleeding, their ability to hold on, so to speak, their want and desire. We've all heard of the fabulous stories of people who want and desire and who don't give in. But at the same time, you succumb to your injuries. Like, it's pretty amazing how fast you can be crushed. And I think this is part of it. When all of a sudden you go in and start moving things around, just one fundamental shift might change somebody from, being in a safe situation to compromising that situation. And
one of those people trapped in there is, of course, Lucy Aylwin. She was working in the mall. We're going to be talking with her fiancé, Gary Jeanbrun, who's in Elliott Lake after the 9:30 news. I want to take a caller now. Eddie in Mississauga has a story to tell about being in a disaster. Eddie, go ahead.
Yes, a lot of people listening here might remember the great train derailment in Mississauga a few decades ago. Whereby we were evacuated. We were out for 4 days ourselves, but 100,000 must have been evacuated in total. The mayor, the fire department, the police department, they were there. They stayed in that zone where we were not allowed, the population, we the citizens, but those firemen, those policemen, emergency workers, they were there.
Yeah, what about that, James? Because some people are saying to bring in the army, bring in other forms of disaster relief. Is that something that should be considered here?
For sure. And I don't believe that they would not be doing this. Obviously, like as I said, it's sometimes the how. And when you have a situation like this where you don't have previous scenarios to compare, it becomes very, very difficult, because all of a sudden you might have 2-3 people with differing opinions, and one insisting that if you go about doing this, this is going to happen, and another person insisting if you try another situation that something else might happen. And it becomes very difficult, because when it comes to the exact hierarchy of decision-making, I think it really boils down to the building people of the city.
Well, it also, the Premier has issued an edict. He stepped in here. Should he have done that, saying, do everything you can and resume these efforts?
Well, that would be my opinion. I believe that, you can't override a system, that the system has to be carried out. From what I understand, any municipality has the right to ask the Army to come in and help when they're given a situation. That's the way I understand it in the larger circumstances.
Okay, we got a lot of people calling, and we're going to get back to their calls in just a moment. And James Lee Center from Dryit.ca will stay on the line with us, taking your calls on this issue. Give us a shout at 416-872-1010 if you have something to say. In a moment, I'm Tasha Keridan on In-Depth Radio, News Talk 1010. Welcome back to the show. Tasha Keridan sitting in for Jerry Agar this week on In-Depth Radio, News Talk 1010. We are talking about the deadly mall collapse in Elliott Lake. We've got with us James Lee Center of Dryit.ca, which is a disaster relief company, and we are taking your calls on the subject, lots of them, lots of people very worried about this situation and also the way it's being handled. Let's talk now with Roy. Roy, you've got a question, I believe.
Well, since 9/11, we've spent millions and billions of dollars cumulatively in this country, in the U.S., militarizing our police force, equipping our firefighters and emergency service workers with the best. We were told the best training and equipment available. Where is it?
Where is it, James? Roy, like a lot of people are saying, why don't we know how to deal with this? It's a lesser disaster than a Katrina or an earthquake in Haiti.
We were prepping our emergency service to deal with a potential another 9/11. And this is just 2 floors of a parking garage collapsing.
Right. So, James, why are we unable, it seems, to get these people out to deal with this? Why has this been such a stop-and-go situation?
Well, I can't speak for Elliott Lake. I have sat down in conference here in Toronto and listened to the City of Toronto, and the Toronto Police have a very, very elite team to deal with this type of thing. I don't believe that if we're having this situation in Toronto that
You're talking about the HUSAR, the Heavy Urban Search and Rescue?
They have to do with biologicals, nuclear, radiological, the whole kit and caboodle. It's a special elite team. They don't really show their cards too much. To be quite frank with you, we just know that they do exist and that they are ready at a moment's notice, and that there's several teams, and they come across as a bunch of Navy SEALs type of thing, and I believe that they're probably perfectly as capable. It all boils down to what this gentleman was saying. You can have all the resources in the world, but if you don't have a plan and you don't have what we refer to as an emergency response plan and the proper people along the way as decision makers, and who's the person who's going to make the decision, who are the people who are going to do the investigations. If you don't have that system, everything falls apart.
Right. Shouldn't we have that system though at this point?
Oh, you would think so. I know Toronto again definitely has a system. As for Elliott Lake, maybe they don't see themselves. I can't speak for the city. They would be inappropriate for me to make these types of assumptions or decisions. For all we know, the decision maker might not be there, and the second in command is all of a sudden put into position that he's not qualified for. Who knows? But the reality is that you must have an emergency response system. Generally speaking, for any situation that is above and beyond the capabilities of something that you can handle yourself, you're supposed to identify the outside resources that you would need to be able to call in a situation like that.
Okay, let's talk with somebody who actually has experience dealing with disasters, specifically fires. We've got Scott in Toronto on the line. Scott, what do you have to say?
Good morning, and thank you for taking my call. And let me say, first of all, I feel very sympathetic to the people of Elliott Lake for the tragedy they're going through. But one of the things that is trained into us is legal liability, competent supervisor, and putting the rescuers at jeopardy. Whether I agree or disagree, it seems it's a CYA thing with the management of any organization nowadays to basically make sure that the training is there. But again, we are always trained that the rescuer comes first.
Well, that is actually interesting because I've got a text here too. Trapped, dead rescue workers mean less help and more time spent rescuing them. Hard decisions, but stopping is the right one. When do you decide to stop, though? Because in our world here, every life is sacred. We go to great lengths to rescue that last person because we believe in life and the importance of preserving life.
And I guess what I'm saying is that as a first responder and a person in the situation, you can't see your surroundings, so you would hope that you have people that are overseeing the incident that won't put you in harm's way. Because once you get in there, you kind of get tunnel vision because you're going after the person or persons trying to rescue them.
Okay.
And that's what we're trained to do. And matter of fact, I just had a 4-day
All right,
course
Scott,
with...
I'm going to have to, unfortunately, I'm going to have to let you go because we're at the bottom of the clock. I want to thank you, though, for your personal story. And James, I want to thank you also, James Lee Center, for joining us and helping us understand how these disasters are managed.